Welcome everybody to the Specifist, going over the logic of emotions. This is actually like there's different layers to this, but we're gonna go over this in a very simplistic understanding way here, because otherwise we'd be going over this for hours. But so to understand emotions, we have to understand how emotions got started. And to do that, we have to understand emotions from the beginning of your life to this moment. And that sounds really complicated, but it's really not. Ultimately, what we really have to understand is that with emotions, your parents actually play a big role in how your emotions are expressed. It's very interesting. So what we've learned, and psychology has learned, is that your parents have an influence on your emotions. So the baby talk that parents do when you're a baby is not a coincidence. It's actually on purpose, because they're expressing your emotions for you, because you don't know what those emotions are, because you don't know anything as a baby, and so they're actually expressing your emotions for you. And the reason why this is important, well, we'll get into why this is important later on, but this is important because if we understand this, we understand that there's a lot more to emotions than just like becoming aware of them. There is a behavior aspect to emotions that's often, it may be only seen partially, but it's a very big part of the process. So to understand emotions, we have to understand the purpose of emotions, the logic of emotions. Why do emotions exist? And ultimately, emotions are about survival. And even if it's not something that would traditionally be seen as survival, like being eaten by a bear or whatever, or not being eaten by a bear, trying to escape a bear or whatever, it's still a survival instinct. So like when a baby cries because a toy breaks or whatever, technically there's no life or death situation involved there, but because the mind doesn't think logically, like, oh, this is not a life or death situation, and so therefore there's no need to become sad or to get annoyed or to get whatever the case might be. And so the logic of emotions is about understanding survival and the case of emotions. And this is all tied into the idea of identity. Identity is this like idea that people talk about, which most people actually don't understand, because it's actually a lot more tied into survival than you might realize. And so when it comes to emotions, what is traditionally considered positive emotions would be tied to what you could call a thriving of a certain part of your identity. So hanging out with friends or family or whatever would create a positive emotion in a certain situation, because it might uphold a certain expectation or mindset you might have about how families act and how families are. But if that mindset is not upheld, and that identity is not upheld, and even if you are with family or friends or whatever, you might be annoyed, you might be negative, you have negative emotions. And this is why. It's all about the nature of survival in this case. So this can get very complicated, actually, but we're going to try and simplify this. So the first part of this is the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So your first level of survival is obviously survival. Needing to eat, thirsty, needing to drink water. And those needs go up higher and higher and higher. We might do a deep episode on this, but it's not necessarily like there's a lot of videos that go into this. And so, in the case of the broken toy, the sadness that's created is because there is something that your identity is tied with when it comes to this broken toy. And so the toy being broken basically equates to a part of your identity has died. And there is a deep level of survival to this, and so you might be like, well, this is not about survival in this case, where a broken toy doesn't kill you. Which, sure, technically that's true, but there is a deeper level here, actually, that this is pointing to. And to understand this, we have to go a little bit philosophical here. We have to go a little bit existential inner knowledge. So there's basically two basic states of being. What we can call the emptiness and what we can call being fulfilled. Being fulfilled means that everything is satisfied, or a particular part of this is satisfied. Wherever you are on the levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But the emptiness is the knowledge in the mind, the threat or the knowledge that this can never last. Because the mind knows, the mind's not extremely stupid. It's not like this thing where you're just like unaware of it. You're unaware of it consciously, but it's an unconsciously knowable thing. And so the empty, or the emptiness, or whatever you want to call it, is a lack of whatever it is that makes you happy. And whatever makes you happy it equates to your furthering your survival in some way. Because your emotions are a survival guide. If you are satisfied, if you are happy, if you're at peace, whatever the case might be, it means that probably most of your needs are fulfilled for the moment. But even in that place, there is the threat of emptiness. And this goes really deep. I don't want to go too deeply into this, because this really could make a complete novel or a complete book, because it goes so deeply into this. But basically, to understand why this is, we have to understand dependent origination, because you are dependent on things to survive. What would happen, for instance, if you didn't drink water for 3 days? You would die. You would get delirious, and then you would die. What would happen if you didn't eat food for a month? You would die, right? And so what dependent origination claims and states, and is true, by the way, is that there is no such thing as a separate, independent self, or a separate, independent anything. Everything is dependent upon everything else in some way. And so the earth is, a lot of the animals on the earth are dependent upon the sun. The sun is dependent upon the atoms in the sun, like the hydrogen and the, all that kind of stuff, right? The helium, or the what is it? Hydrogen, oxygen, not oxygen, sorry. Anyways, you know what I mean. To create fusion, that fusion is something that the world, that Earth needs for its survival, the survival of different animals on this planet, and other things as well, are create dependent origination. Those things are also dependent upon other animals that might be lower on the so-called food chain. But even if you discount this somehow, like, oh, well, spiritually speaking, that might be true, but spiritually speaking, like, we're all one. Okay, maybe that's true, right? But this is not true physically speaking. Like, even within our own selves, so to speak, our own bodies, there's a lot more that creates the self than you might realize. And I don't want to go too deeply into this because it really could make an entire book. But even the idea of self is dependent upon many things for it to work. Like the brain, the neurons in the brain create what we call emergent systems. And so this goes very deeply. And the environment creates the self from past to present moment experience. And so unconsciously, the brain knows this. The mind knows this emptiness could show up at any moment because, well, things happen. Things are empty, ultimately, of inherent individuation. Their individuation is dependent upon different things to exist. Food, the sun, whatever it is. And so to deal with this, it attempts to fill this emptiness. But because this emptiness is not completely fulfillable, it can create a sort of parasitism that happens where you are attempting to fill the emptiness. You might fill it up for a second, but it'll drain away. You might fill your belly full of food, but it doesn't last very long. Your food starts getting digested. You become less happy, and then you fill it again. It's a constant need to be filled up process. And so emotions, the logic of emotions is attempting to fulfill something that cannot be fully fulfilled, and attempting to keep something that cannot fully be kept. So identity, the purpose of identity, and the purpose of emotions and the purpose of identity are very similar. But the purpose of identity is to keep stable something that is inherently unstable. What does it really mean to be the self? And this is where we get to deep philosophical natures of self and emotions. And I don't want to go too deeply into this, but what does it mean to be self? Just the self. Well, there's a lot of things that are dependent on this. You have to survive. Like, the bottom level is you have to actually literally survive, which means eating food, drinking water, having sunlight. But the things that you're eating have to survive as well. So, like, if you eat all the food in the world, nothing else, you won't be able to survive after this. And so other things have to survive, which means that they have to find other ways of surviving. And we're getting very deep here. We're getting very epistemological, metaphysical. But ultimately, identity is attempting to keep this process stable when it's inherently unstable because it's based on something that cannot fully last. But it's doing that because to do that is to keep you from dying, is to keep you from, all these other things. And then survival becomes at higher levels. Let's say if we're talking spirodynamics, which is another element of this that we don't really want to get into here. But at the higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for instance, it's less about survival in a life or death situation, but more of a survival in a community-driven or purpose-driven situation. There are levels beyond Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which are honestly is something we don't want to go into deeply here because a lot of people would disagree with it. But anyways, there are levels beyond this, but most people are not going to be able to see those levels. So the logic of emotion is to keep the identity stable. And so like if you, for instance, to give you an example, anger is often used because something feels unfair or some boundary of yours is threatened in some way. So like you might have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever, and that you're in a relationship with this person, and they do or say something that goes against one of your current boundaries. What is the response? Anger, because there is something about that boundary that keeps your identity stable. If that boundary is threatened, what happens? This is where egotism becomes what it is. This is why people are egotistical. This is the nature of this, because the nature of emptiness. Because the nature of life is that everything is ultimately empty, and this does not mean that nothing exists. What it means is that nothing is inherently itself. Self, or let's say, for instance, you are not some separate entity. You are dependent upon many conditions to be what you are currently. Your brain has to work properly. You have to have enough food and water every day, which means you're also dependent upon your job, and your job is dependent upon whatever your current job is, or whatever it is. So everything is dependent upon everything else in this way. And once you understand this, and this sounds more complicated than it is, it sounds really complicated because I have to communicate this very explicitly, but it's actually less complicated than it sounds. It sounds very complicated because I'm attempting to communicate in ways that we don't actually communicate. I've actually very much become aware that like most of what we call communication is not actually communication. And that we actually don't know how to communicate with each other very well as societies or as people, which is why we end up having fights over nothing at all, or like the smallest little things. And so yeah, like this is the nature of this. And I know this gets very convoluted. This might even make no sense to you right now. But the purpose of this is to help you to become more understanding of what's happening with yourself and with others. Why is this happening? Like why are all these political fights happening? People might think it's because people are just getting stupider, and to some extent that's what's happening, but there's a lot more that's happening here than just like, oh no, this other side is just racist or evil or dumb. No, there's something else that's happening here. Something so fundamentally almost metaphysical and existential that to literally have a disagreement at these levels means a death of your current level of identity. And that's why we're seeing these problems. I'm not saying that like one side is right, the other side is wrong, or both sides are stupid. Each side has some, what I call, accuracies. But the problem isn't the sides. The problem is they're unaware of any of this. They're unaware of what I'm talking about. They're unaware of the nature of this. And so it creates a major problem where now they have to defend it. They have to become aware. And so, like, to avoid changing their identity, to avoid that emptiness, that empty feeling within themselves, they create the points game. Oh no, I won 1,000,000 points, even though you might have only won like 100,000 points or whatever in this, pretend game that we're playing, because we're trying to create this illusion of stability that doesn't exist. And this might seem very bleak and dark to you. Like, oh no, David, I can't believe you're saying this. Like, this sounds really negative and dark, and like, you're saying that like all of our problems comes down to survival in this way. This is very bleak. Like, why would you say this? It's so negative. Like, what is happening here? But I'm not saying this to put you in a dark place, but to help you to become aware of what's happening. But to do that, you have to actually become aware of when this is happening to yourself. This is not something that like I can teach you. Because I used to believe this too, like, oh, it's just people being dumb. It isn't. It's literally a metaphysical or existential threat to their survival, their identity's survival. So, this is where we get into the nature of emptiness. And the truth of emptiness is that you cannot fulfill emptiness. Not really. You can you can temporarily do it, but it won't last. And to attempt to keep emptiness filled will create parasitism and a parasitic mindset, which is what we see. Which is why we see people who have millions of dollars but still seem to crave more. Or maybe they're middle class, but still they're trying to crave more. Whatever the case might be. It's not because they're greedy, it's because they're stuck in this place of emptiness. They don't understand that emptiness cannot be fulfilled. And this is where I know people are going to tune this out because they're not going to be willing to see this for themselves. No, David, you can't say that. That's too bleak and too dark. And, like, I'd rather believe that, like, there is no such thing as this emptiness. And that we are full and we can become full and we can be in happiness all our lives. And so you'll probably have a bunch of implicit assumptions that come about because I'm telling you these kinds of things. But I'm not telling you that this means that life somehow is bleak or dark or negative. But because we have this identity crisis, it's literally an identity crisis. Because we have been taught in our culture for like the last fucking 25, 30 years to deconstruct everything through like movies like The Matrix and like none of this is real and this kind of thing. That the emptiness and the threat of the emptiness is more common now than it was. And while I think deconstruction is good and it has some good places, it is honestly overdone and creates a serious gap. Which is why I think even more now that this is why oftentimes politics has become very much like it is, because of this very threat. Because before, like if you had, let's say for instance, if you were in 2000 or 2010 or whatever, and you might have had an argument with somebody. Maybe it wasn't so good, but like maybe you could get over it, or maybe you could like deal with this person. Even dare I say it, even like 2016 to some extent, it wasn't as good as that, but it's close. But because there's become so much more awareness of the emptiness because of things like COVID and because of the inflation under Biden and this kind of thing, this is becoming more and more something that we're aware of, which is what's creating more and more of the division. I mean, sure, some of it has to do with political decisions as well, and some of the mindsets of the Republicans or the Democrats, whatever the case is. But a lot of it has to do with this. A lot of this has to do with the fact of that the emptiness, the threat of emptiness is closer than it was. Because of deconstructionism, because of postmodernism, and because of the uncertainties caused by inflation and by COVID and by all these different things. And so it's no coincidence that because of this, you have more division. So it's not a negative thing, it's not a positive thing, it's just something to become aware of. To notice in yourself. Notice this attempt to push away the emptiness. This emptiness, the more that you push it away, the more that it comes towards you, in a sense. It's actually the opposite. Like most of the time, if you chase something, it actually runs away. But the more that you push the emptiness away, the more it actually comes closer. Because the attempt to push emptiness away actually shows your mind that this emptiness exists, which is the nature of the identity crisis, which is why we have people now who seem to have no purpose. Now we have like men who don't seem to know what a man is, and like when am I as a man, whatever that is. partially because that's been gotten rid of and changed, but also partly because of this. So this is the nature of emotions. This is how emotions work. And well, a lot of spiritual teachers will tell you that the answer to this is to destroy all identity and this kind of thing. I have a more nuanced view on this. And a lot of it has to do with like going between the extremes of one teaching or another. And ultimately, I think there's two basic things to do here. One is to become familiar with the emptiness. Not only become familiar with the emptiness, but become familiar with why the emptiness exists. Seeing others and their actions and how possibly that might be caused by the emptiness and the attempting to escape from the emptiness. Now, and step 2 is to find structure. Like, this is where I differ from a lot of teachers, though. Like, this is not this is something I recommend kind of thing. This is my possibility. This is what I do. But this is not something I recommend for people to do. So step 2 is to look or find a structure. It might be easier to find a structure out there somewhere, like religion or whatever the case is. But ultimately, the way out of this is structure, and even, I would say, even to some extent, what we would call extreme levels of structure. Like to where people nowadays, if they were to see the structure level, the extreme levels of structure that you would be doing, you'd be like, that doesn't sound good. That doesn't sound like it would make me feel good, and like that sounds uncomfortable. Because you're going beyond your need for emotional stability or instability, and you're going beyond the need for happiness and peace. I might do a deep episode on nihilism, because this also goes into nihilism in different ways as well, because nihilists see the emptiness, but they actually read way too much into the emptiness. That's the major problem with nihilism, is that it sees that life is ultimately empty, but they don't understand what that means. And so they find meaning in meaninglessness itself, which is not meaninglessness, which is the major problem with nihilism. Which is why I want to do an episode on nihilism, actually, but yeah. So anyways, I know this is a longer episode, and it goes way too deeply into different things. Maybe one day I definitely want to try and simplify this, but for now, this is the episode. Hope you enjoy this one, and I'll talk to you in the next one. So, some final caveats before I end this episode. Since I'm sure it's going to come up. So, this is just a basic idea. This is just to help you to understand what's happening, and yourself and others. This is not like something that always exists in this particular way. But it is something that I think helps to understand why a lot of these problems are happening, and what's happening and why. And really what we're trying to do here is we're trying to help you to go a little bit beyond the content of emotions and into the structure, like what makes emotions work, what is actually happening here, the logic of emotions, the logic of reality in a future episode, perhaps. So hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will talk to you in the next one.